The work in the show is Forehead from 1997. Do you go back to look at work again, think about work again, or refer back to it at all?
I'm trying to think about 1997, let alone the work.
Just trying to remember, yeah.
Yes, I think
the thing is that we try not to have a linear approach to the work anyway. So things kind of like phase in and out of our consciousness at a kind of non-temporal sort of rate-ish.
Yeah, I mean things, you know, they tend to represent themselves. So the idea of actually thinking them in as Dino said, in a linear sequence, we don't really have that kind of view of the work, really.
I mean, at the moment we've kind of got very small versions of Forehead, populating sort of the latest versions of Hell.
So has your work changed at all over the years? I mean, do you see a progression, or do you identify something like that?
Our interest in regurgitating old ideas or same idea is more to do with a kind of an idea of a convoluted notion of making art rather than a kind of a progressive teleological way of making art. You know, we're not really interested in the idea of perfecting things towards some ideal sort of conclusion. I think we're more interested in scraping the bottom of the barrel,
scrabbling away at scabs,
and looking under the bottom of the barrel, and
then looking underneath the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah, So there's no purposeful evolution in the work. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of it's purposefully involuted.
It's a process. The process is more important than the goal.
I mean, I think there's a lot of the work we make it operates in a series or a repetitious series, and so in some senses, that once the work achieves its momentum, it kind of becomes quite dominant in a way. We kind of become the little parasitical fleas on the back of the work, in a sense. Just trying to cajole it in the way that we, hopefully try and kind of put in some kind of ambition, some kind of aim, but it ignores it. It makes the work. We get depressed.
So, tails wagging dogs comes to mind. You kind of discover something. You discover a seam of interest, and it becomes more interesting than looking for another seam. It's kind of I mean, we are part of the process as much as everything else is. We're only a little bit of it. We're not the bosses.
So who is the boss then? There are no bosses.
There are no bosses. No.
How political is your work?
How political do you want it to be? It's political in as much as it's critical, I guess. It's part of the critical project, it challenges a few ideas. It's political because it kind of undermines its own premise. I mean, that's it. I guess it's super political because it's not ideological, because it doesn't seek to establish a set perspective. It seeks to undermine its own perspective each time. So it's kind of like, as I said, saying before, the subject of its politics is itself.
So there's no explicit political message within it. It's just a kind of seeking to rupture, perhaps, bourgeoisie sensibilities. Part
of the problem with that is that those two things are not inconsistent. The idea of kind of bourgeois notions of tolerance. We are, in a sense, the vanguard of, not us personally, but art. They're kind of the internal mechanisms of doubt, self-doubt, and cynicism and pessimism are just exactly how a bourgeois audience tests its tolerance. So the more you kind of stamp on your own feet, to the cheers and applaud of the bourgeois public. I mean, that's it's kind of like a small child.
Just like 5-year-olds.
A small child slapping its face, thinking it's hurting you.
Yeah, I'm going to hurt you, mummy. Watch. It doesn't hurt.
Yeah. So but you have to kind of exclude that from the forefront of your mind when you're producing the work. Otherwise, there'd be no point in making it.
You couldn't do it if you knew the truth.
Well, if you just
Yeah.
Do you even think of the viewer, or do you kind of purposely ignore them?
We have to kind of distance ourselves from the viewers and everybody else as much as possible. Otherwise, we just couldn't do it.
In some ways, we've tried to rectify that kind of slight paradox by trying to produce this, that in one way in which you can slip the kind of necessity of sort of bourgeois logic is to be as pessimistic as possible, to not try to, because ultimately with bourgeois, even with kind of bourgeois, the taste for, the appetite for kind of, avant-gardist antics, there's still something which has to be kind of redemptive. The bourgeois public still wants some kind of notion that even though it can be shit and piss and nastiness and chopping up and maiming, there still has to be some kind of, it has to be appropriated to some form of kind of, some logical outcome which has to be redemptive, some kind of positivity. I think that what we've tried to do is try and make work which kind of avoids redemption, which of course in itself is absolutely impossible, because the more we dignify the work with discourse, it leads directly back to that notion of, kind of liberal humanist discourses that are, self-policing and ultimately moral and ultimately redemptive.
You've said that you've never heard or spoken to anyone who was actually shocked by your work. So is that kind of a media configuration? It's kind of something that's written about as opposed to an actual real reaction to it?
It's a pantomime.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a pantomime that we all agree to kind of prance around in our various guises.
But it's the premise of transgression, isn't it? And the notion of transgression is that, it has to be predicated upon the agreement to have something which is of value, which then is transgressed. I mean, transgression doesn't go through the world kind of devaluing value forever. All that happens is the value reasserts itself and then the transgression occurs again, which is...
It's a mechanism to make sure everything's kind of new and shiny and we don't get bored of ourselves too quick.
There's so much of this kind of tabloid coverage of artists at the moment. It really seemed a moment where art was being covered by the kind of popular press, which seems to have dissipated now and certainly wasn't always the case. Why do you think was that a kind of greed moment? Was that the pantomime you're talking about?
You kind of think about the kind of the working class, tabloid sort of reaction to that was, what the fuck are these bricks? Why? In a sense, they were asking. This was a politically motivated institutional critique of the museum. What the hell are these things doing here? So in a sense, they were asking the right questions, even though they're dressed up in sort of kind of anger and rage and stuff. But they were kind of, the questions that at least they were asking is pointing at some bricks and saying, what the fuck is that doing here? Is a question which the work is trying to answer itself. I mean, because there's an alienation between the kind of the working process by which those people would have a more appropriate way of actually understanding it by a kind of historical understanding of the work. But they understood that the thing being there was begging the question of what the fuck is it doing there? Whereas what happened, later on with the YBA thing is that it kind of harnessed the ambitions of the gentrified classes that were then suddenly not asking what the fuck is that doing there, but how do I get that into my house, And so what those people were doing was that they were associating the aesthetic tyranny of the work of art as being something which was consistent with their financial tyranny, their financial domination.
But do you think that came about because of the particular moment in the wider kind of political environment, the confirmation of neoliberal politics with kind of Blair and just pre-Blair Thatcherism?
Really? Libertarian individual, the speculative markets, the shift from Labour to new Labour, which was like, well, they should have called it New Equity, not New Labour. Suddenly the notion, it was a kind of a seismic reverberation of the kind of French bourgeois revolution in a sense. It's like, suddenly the English were having their middle class revolution about 5 billion years late after everyone else, And that's that's where we are now, I guess. It's just the absolute sort of authority of the middle classes.